A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillah rahmanir rahim, which means I begin in the name of God, the most merciful, the most gracious. And I'm here with you, Eram Saeed, with another episode of the Jamali Bridge podcast. And my co-host, Chris Atwood, is currently in India, going through a power outage, which a lot of Pakistanis and Indians are very familiar with. So Chris is looking like an illuminated saint because of the way the light is falling on his face. So this works out perfectly. But in this recording, we might lose Chris once in a while because of the poor connection. And we are being joined today by a wonderful, amazing Pakistani female scholar who lives in UK, Sitara Akram. I'm so excited to have Sitara as our guest today. She is an independent researcher with interest in Islamic law, economics, and women's rights. She recently completed her PhD in Islamic finance from the University of Leeds. In her thesis, she has given a new definition of riba or usury, which is interest, according to Islamic law. Sitara works full-time as a mid-senior level leader at the University of Leeds. She's passionate about justice and reducing inequalities. She has taught both at universities in the community and more recently reading the Quran with teenagers. Sitara is married and is the mother of twin sons, both now at university. And Sitara shares her research and reflections on her YouTube channel, which we will provide the link in the description. It is youtube.com /@Sitara Akram. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you very much, Eram. Thank you for the warm welcome and the very generous introduction. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
As have I, and I know Chris has been looking forward to it as well, because the purpose of this podcast is to build bridges, not just between Muslims and non-Muslims, but also between Muslims and those who are perhaps, what would I say, still more attached to orthodoxy and need to adjust some of their viewpoints in order to be more in line and alignment with what the modern day life requires, especially regarding rights of women and human rights. So, Chris, do you want to begin or should I begin with my first question?
Oh, I'd love to. First of all, Sitara, thank you again so much for being with us. For me, this is an exciting journey because, as you probably know, Eram and I have been working together for over a decade, and she, as a non-Muslim, she's been educating me on the beauty and the depth and the breadth of Islam. So I come into this podcast really inspired by the opportunity to both inform, educate, and to inspire both Muslims and non-Muslims with the depth and the beauty of the Islamic religion and the Islamic faith. And as you are probably aware, for many non-Muslims, because of events over the last 20, 25 years, Islam is a little scary, just to be honest. And so I think the more that we can really understand, and I'm speaking as a non-Muslim here, more non-Muslims can understand what Islam really is and what it means to be a Muslim, the more we can contribute to creating the peaceful world that we all want to live in. So thank you again for part of this. And so I wanted to begin.
Can I say something, Chris?
Yes, you can, of course, Eram.
I just want to give some background to Sitara that, as you probably already know, Sitara, Chris has been my dear friend, my mentor, and we have also worked together in business. I have known him for over a decade now, almost a decade. And, I always tell people he is one of the most awake, most wise people I know, always in integrity. I have seen him go through so many things in life, both personal, professional, all kinds of things, and I have never once seen him out of integrity. So a lot of times when we would have these Islamic discussions, I would say to him, Chris, you are actually a Momin. I'm not even going to call you a Muslim because you're a Momin. Momin is a higher level of Muslim, Chris. It's like you have Iman, you have faith. So a person who has faith is a Momin. Like you are a moment, and I have very few moments that I can compare you to, because it's such a high level of iman. His integrity, his attachment, or his connection or commitment to ethics and consciousness, and then his beautiful connection to God. He was the one who inspired me to make Allah my best friend. He was the one who inspired me to have a different understanding of taqwa, which is a compassionate awareness of God all the time, and making God your highest priority in everything that you do in life. So I always tell him, Chris, you don't know it, but you are a moment. You believe in Allah. You believe that Quran is God's book. You also have great respect for Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him. You believe he's a prophet. That's it. You've got it, buddy. Anyway, so I just wanted to give that background to Sitara. Now, please continue.
Thank you, Eram. And I take that as a great compliment and with great humility. Thank you so much for that. So Sitara, you've done a lot of studying, it seems, and you have a PhD in Islamic finance. You're a strong, independent woman who has both lived in the East and lived in the West. And so you've been exposed to different cultures, to different ideas, to different perspectives. And I wonder if you would share with us how those experiences have affected your own relationship with your faith, with Allah, with how has that changed your perspective on Islam and what Islam means to you and what it means to be a Muslim?
That's a very in-depth question, isn't it? we could discuss perspectives for a period of time, but I think very briefly, yes, I am a very independent person. I think some of it is to do with your own personality and what you value. So you do grow as a person and you make choices about how you want to develop as a person. But also sometimes there is luck in your favor as well. So I grew up in a household where women's education was equally as valued as men's education. So there was no differentiation between boys and girls in terms of access to education. I was always very geeky. I loved books. I think it also came from the fact that my father had this rule in the house that whilst he could say no to other forms of consumerism, he would not say no to buying books. So he could say no to buying new clothes or buying new toys or anything like that. But when it came to books, the answer was yes. And actually, I've had the same value system in my house where I would say no to my sons for new smartphones. But if they want to buy books, not a problem. We can buy books. And I think very early on, I just had a love of learning. It was just something that was just part of who I was. My husband often jokes about it that my answer to everything in life is to buy a book. This is what I do. I get curious, I buy a book, I want to find out more. So it's no wonder that I've eventually ended up doing a PhD on top of a full-time job. So I'm not an academic, but then I feel that I've lived two lives where I am a manager, yes, but I also have taught at universities and been engaged in academia for a very long period of time now, nearly 20 years. So being in the East, with its culture, its identity, its traditions, its folklore, its language, its proverbs, is a very powerful experience. I had a very, very strong, very grounded sense of identity in Pakistan. And it's interesting then that when I moved to the UK, just at that point, I had towards a conservative version of Islam. And I was saying to Eram just now that it's also a function of time. It was the moment we were living through, late 1990s, early 2000s, when a particular very conservative form of Islam came onto the horizon. Patriarchy reasserted itself, continues to do that. And there was very much a turn towards orthodoxy and an orientation towards the past. And I wasn't quite aware of those currents until I moved to the UK. And then here, coming from a majority Muslim country where pretty much everybody's Muslim, to living in a country where you are a minority. Sometimes you're a minority in the limelight because yes, they could be Islam. I personally haven't experienced Islamophobia, but I know people have experienced Islamophobia. They've experienced anti-Muslim hatred. And suddenly the questions around empire and colonial history and how it continues to impact us, those questions become very important. The other thing that happened was because my sons were very young when we came here, they were toddlers, so they started school. So their schooling is completely different from my schooling. My schooling happened in Pakistan. They were doing a very different type of schooling. So here in the West, children turn 4 and the first thing they learn is why. So they come home and it's like, why? Mom, why do we have these rules? Why should I follow these rules? Why am I reading the Quran in Arabic in a language I don't understand? So you're almost forced to become a more informed parent because you need to answer these really critical questions because, critical thinkers are being raised in the household. So my husband and I had to do quite a lot of reading and growing up to try to respond to some of their questions. But I suppose, Chris, for me, what I really loved, because I had grown up with an understanding that Islam as a religion values education. Education was one of the central ethical values we were taught. We used to say, and I know this Hadith tradition is not authentic, but there used to be this Hadith tradition going around that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that if you have to go to China to study, then you should go to China to study. So, of course, he wouldn't be talking about China. We know that that's anachronistic, but it was a very inspiring quote. So if you had to travel distances to seek learning, then you would do that. But it's only when I came here to the West, and because I happened to work in a university, which is a university with huge amounts of resources, I just realized just how much knowledge is valued. And knowledge is valued to the extent that so much resource is thrown at it. The fact that people have entire careers, research careers through knowledge creation, libraries full of millions of books. I can write to the library and say, I want this book, which is sitting in the British Library in London, and they will arrange for that to come to me. So knowledge comes to you, people create an enabling condition. And it felt to me that this love of knowledge, this orientation around knowledge was perhaps more closely aligned to my values. And I could actually come to some kind of fruition around that, some realization around that, which I couldn't do actually, because Pakistan is a low-income country. We do have resource constraints. And while we talk about a knowledge tradition, unfortunately, we haven't been able to nurture it the way it has been nurtured here. And it's no wonder that, some of the top universities then are in this country. So I think for me, coming to the West and really understanding the value it places on knowledge was a real paradigm shift for me. The other paradigm shift for me, coming from my professional background, was that women's ideas were not being dismissed on the basis of gender. So unfortunately, because we do have a resurgent and a reassertive patriarchy in Islamic discourses now, women are often dismissed because of their gender, and nobody really listens to their ideas. Whereas here, I found that my ideas were valued for their merit, for their quality, and that was incredibly empowering. So I feel then that I am a much more informed Muslim. And in fact, I have become more aware of my own history as a former British colony after coming here, ironically, than I ever was in Pakistan, because we're not taught history, or certainly we're not taught history as an academic discipline with that academic rigor as it is taught here. And I do joke about this often, that if I was born and raised in this country, I would have done history as my undergrad and not business and finance. I'm very proud of the fact that one of my twins is studying history and philosophy at university. I'm really proud of that. And I can see the maturity develop in his thinking as well. So yes, I think the East I come from the East. I embrace it. I own it. I'm a very authentic person. I never try to step away from my roots or my identity. I'm very secure in that, but equally, I really value the opportunities around knowledge that I have gained after moving here. So for me, it's been an incredibly personally fulfilling journey, and not one that's made me kind of, you'll find that I'm not a defensive Muslim. I'm not defensive about my Muslimness or my identity. I'm really comfortable in it. And I found a really nice home where I can be myself, and where I can actually realize my potential. I think I can do that much better here. And I think my sons are much more informed Muslims because I've had to answer all of their why questions. I think your electricity is back as well, Chris.
I think it is. And, thank you so much for sharing that, Sitara. And Eram, please jump in whenever you want. I can keep talking nonstop if you
No,
give me
please
enough.
do. I've been interviewing Sitara, so your turn. I want you to ask the questions. Uh-oh, I think he got frozen. Maybe he has to switch Wi-Fi from his phone.
Yes, yeah, it might be that. But at least we're able to see him better.
Here we are.
Okay,
Yeah,
here
you're
I came
back.
back. I just wanted to mention, and I'm going to switch my internet in just a moment, but if you can hear me, I just wanted to mention that as I have learned more about Islamic history, the history of the Muslims in the world, I mean, for one thing, I mean, I'm sure it's second nature to you, but how amazing is it that over 2 billion, over a quarter of the world's population are Muslims, you know? I mean, this is an important piece of information to have, and to understand this body of knowledge is incredibly important. And then the other thing, I don't know how, because of the way our education, we do have in the West this dedication to education, but it tends to be a little bit still slanted, you know, because until I was an adult, I didn't really know much about, and even today, I would say I don't know as much as I could or should know about the incredible contributions that Muslim scholars have made to the advance of knowledge, particularly in that period between the 8th century and the 15th century. You know, the mathematics and geometry, and you know, there's just a whole slew of things we take for granted today that are the result of the studies and insights of Islamic scholars. And so
Yeah.
I'm speaking in favor of Islamic history for non-Muslims as well as Muslims, you know?
Yeah. And a lot of non-Muslims, Muslims don't know that. I mean, you can excuse non-Muslims
Yeah.
for not knowing it, but a lot of Muslims actually do not know their history. I was guilty of that too, as you've seen my journey, Chris. And like Sitara had to get more educated or well-informed to be able to answer her sons, which I also had to do because of my daughters. But I think the pressure on me really started when I, started this Eram Saeed platform, went viral, and was pretty sure and confident about what I believed in until I started getting all these questions. And then I constantly I'm constantly up leveling my education, and very grateful to women like Sitara, like Lina Ali, like Daisy Khan, who have done all this research so that people like me can go on YouTube and watch a video, and 30 minutes later, it's like, which might have taken her 3 years. I know it now in 30 minutes, that's very helpful. But it wasn't just in the sciences, Chris. It's remarkable the contributions that that Muslim scholars have made, where it's just enormous when we begin to do our research and we find, for example, I just learned this recently, that the term human rights, this term came from Islam. The first Muslim scholar to come up with this term, it was called Hukukul Adamiyat, which literally translates as human rights. So that came from Islam as well. And another thing that was very exciting that I learned not too long ago, Chris, was that, because I would always wonder that in the early centuries, we know Muslim women were not oppressed. And then we are here, fast forward, like what happened in between, like almost 800, 900 years? Why don't we see the works of women scholars? We know that women held very important positions in terms of knowledge and sharing knowledge, and they were muftis and scholars and all those things. But how come we don't hear their names? Why don't we see any evidence? And then I was listening to this other scholar. I was talking to Sitara about it. His name is Khalid Abul Fadl, and he was talking about the same thing. And he said, did you know that there are thousands upon thousands of manuscripts of the works of female Muslim scholars? Because, first paper wasn't invented, then paper got invented, but it was like parchment. And so it was all handwritten stuff. And there were thousands upon thousands of manuscripts of both men and women. But when it came time with the printing press and to publish work, by that time, patriarchy had, started. So the works of women scholars did not get published, but they're there. They're still there. So I'm excited to see one day when, inshallah, as we say, God willing, their works will also come into the forefront. And why that's important is because there are some names in this Muslim scholarship that are considered giants. You know, they're men, but they're considered giants because of their position. And interestingly, a lot of them were students of women scholars, you know, whose works did not get published. So anyway.
So Sitara, what this brings up for me is there's a kind of paradox, because what I've learned from Eram and from my own studies is that Islam really contains some of those beautiful and profound teachings that exist in the world. And as we've just been talking about, Muslims have made huge contributions to human history. But there are also these contradictions in terms of the practice of Islam. It seems, that the treatment of women in some countries, like in Afghanistan, the Eram has shared with me, and Eram, maybe you can share better than I can the exact wording, but this thing about lying. You remember you told me that a Muslim, could you share that piece? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, and Sitara will be able to comment on whether, excuse me, we can accept the authenticity of the hadith. However,
Okay.
the context of the hadith is very relevant to all of, Islamic framework and the flavor we see in the Quran, which is about lying, Sitara. So the hadith
And for non-Muslims watching, could you explain what hadith is, just for those who may not?
Hadith basically, so we have two sources of knowledge in Islam, two main sources. One is Quran, which is the divine word revealed directly to Prophet Muhammad through Angel Gabriel, and it was recorded while it was being revealed. So we, as Muslims, believe it is 100% accurate and authentic. And then Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was supposed to be the living example of the teachings of the Quran. And so, well, how do we know about his life and how did he teach that through action? Because he existed almost 1500 years ago. So then we have, of course, the historical tradition, but we also have this body of knowledge called hadith, which is the sayings of the Prophet. So they were collected a couple of hundred years after the death of Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, and but their narration chains were in those days, supposed to be verified, double verified, triple verified, and there's a lot of really great knowledge that comes from this source. But the mistake people started to make, and Sitara can comment whenever you want to, Sitara, I feel the mistake people started to make was that hadith was supposed to be for reference. Quran was supposed to be the main body of knowledge and how we were supposed to, continuously read and interpret. People started elevating hadith almost now to where it is at the level of Quran for some people, and for some people even higher than Quran, because they will, if they find a hadith that is contradictory to the Quran, they will defend the hadith and not the Quran. So that's where a lot of the confusion and contradictions have started to take place. A lot of the interpretations got sidetracked because people would consult the hadith, and from that lens, they would go interpret the Quran. So do you want to say anything on that, Sitara, or should I continue with the
Yeah, it's no, that's really helpful. I was thinking as you were speaking, Iram, in terms of hadith, that hadith is basically the collective memory of the Prophet. So Chris, this is, the Prophet's companions and then their future generation, their children and then their children, trying to preserve the memory of the Prophet, who was a very great man. And people wanted to try to recall how he behaved, how he smiled, how he sat, how he ate, but also some of the decisions that he made. Quite early on in Islamic, if you look at the Islamic knowledge tradition, quite early on, there were debates about whether hadith should be relied on as a source of law or not, because it didn't exist as written reports for the first couple of 100 years. It only became compiled in the form of kind of the versions that we have now. There was an entire process of canonization that took place, and some hadith books were elevated to the status of canon. that they were more reliable than other books of hadith. So after about 200 years after Prophet Muhammad SAW passed away, there were discussions about whether law should now rely on these textual reports, which preserve the memory of the Prophet. And similar, you can see a similar movement happening in Quran exegesis as well. So when the Quran is being understood, whereas early on we find that people used to use rationality or reason and lived practice to understand the Quran, once the Hadith text becomes available, then our scholars tend to veer more and more towards the textual reports. Now, it's complex, kind of that legal theory development is complex, but I think what has happened now is a particular amplification and intensification of that methodology. I think intensification. So what Eram is referring to in terms of people just quickly looking up Hadith report, taking a very literalist view of the report, discarding the context of it's very difficult to find the context of a Hadith report, by the way, because it's a snippet. It's memory, it's partial memory, it's a snippet. It's very difficult to understand the totality of circumstances in which it originated. There's a lot of research on it, so you can make a good guess about the totality of circumstances, but then you have to undertake quite serious scholarly effort. So I think what has happened is that Hadith is now being used and misused often by people who don't really understand the type of knowledge, the type of knowledge material it is, and what you need are kind of quite advanced skills to be able to understand the Hadith literature and to then talk about its authenticity. But it is true to say that in this long journey over the last 1400 years, a lot of the law, the substantive law that we see in Islam actually does rely on Hadith materials. And that's to do with a certain shift. It's a methodological preference. But it is something that is being critiqued by scholars who are now called reformists. I mean, when I say, I always say this, when I use the word reform, I do not use it in the Eurocentric Christian sense of reformation of the church. Not at all. When I'm talking about reform, I'm talking more about scholars critiquing some of these methodological decisions that our early scholars took and thinking about going back to sources. So one of the things that's come out now is that apart from the textual sources, the really reliable method of transmission of the Islamic way of life is the sunnah, or the normative praxis of the Prophet. It's how we live as Muslims. So you would have seen, Chris, things like Muslims will say Assalamu alaikum, or they would say Bismillah, in the name of Allah before they start a task or they start eating. This is the normative praxis of the Prophet. And this is actually, in the early days of Islam, was considered to be a more reliable source of Islamic knowledge than Hadith, because Hadith came later. So I know it's quite a complex thing for our non-Muslim listeners, but I suppose you can see then the richness of the Islamic tradition, that it is able to critique itself. It is able to ask these questions. I think the unfortunate thing is that often, because Muslims have been in very, very difficult circumstances the last 150 odd years or so, since the formation of the nation state, since the advent of colonialism, and particularly the damage to Muslim identity and its institutions that was done by colonial powers. So we're very, how do I put it? It's almost like we become a bit unmoored, like we're a ship sailing a raging sea, and we can't really navigate ourselves. We can't find the stars that would help us navigate in the right direction. So we feel that way. We're floating in a very stormy sea. But the knowledge tradition of Islam is actually able to critique itself. And I think some people like myself who are working in that reformist space are trying to bring that vibrancy back and say, yes, we are able to step back. We are able to critique. We are able to create new knowledge. We don't have to say the same things and be regurgitative, say the same things the scholars have been saying for 1,000 years. We can actually say new things. But it continues to be a very contentious area, and you do get a lot of aggressive reaction to that. But I think, as with any knowledge tradition, that would happen. Just very quickly, if I'm allowed, just a couple more things that I want to add. Because you mentioned, Chris, the stilted nature of the knowledge tradition in the West. I think something similar is happening here, because we know that the Western knowledge tradition for a long period now has been positivist. So we'll believe science, but we will not believe in spiritual aspects of human beings. We know that psychology does not grapple with the idea of soul. The idea of soul is completely missing from Western psychology, whereas in Eastern traditions, the idea of soul or spirit is actually part of their philosophical outlook. But also the decoloniality movements, which are now happening in universities across the US, here in Britain as well, So people understand that the knowledge tradition is stilted. We know that Orientalist tropes can come in. Islam can be seen as that alien, exotic, barbaric religion, medieval. There are some really negative tropes about Islam, but I think that awareness of the fact that knowledge here in the West is very Eurocentric and European values are often seen as universal values, I think that is being critiqued. So even in the Western tradition, there is this maturity that you can step back and criticize your own knowledge tradition. I know it's still controversial. There are barriers to it. So an example for my sons always say this to me, but why have you not taught colonialism in school? And you're not. In Britain, you're not taught colonialism in school. Something as formative for Britain as colonialism in the last 200 years surely should be taught at school, but it's not. It's not part of the history curriculum. So I would hope that as the Western stilted knowledge tradition becomes more comfortable with acknowledging its stiltedness and doing away with some of the supremacist assumptions as well around universal values, European values are the best values. I think once it starts stepping back a little bit, it will open up that space to reckon, for the West to reckon with its own history. So I think these things are happening in the West, but I think Muslims just have to do a lot more work about our knowledge tradition, because I think we felt very insecure and very unanchored for a long period of time, we also become very defensive and very touchy about things, which then means that it becomes difficult to turn the internal critical eye inwards, if that makes sense.
Sure, of course.
Yeah.
I think Americans maybe more than British can relate to the sort of stilted view and the colonialist perspective that Great Britain brought to the world, simply because America was colonies. It took a major war to be able to get freedom from that. And so there is more about colonialism that's taught in America, but it's still stilted. Just as you said, it's still slanted in more the sort of the Western American, British, European sort of perspective on things. I really, forgive me for going off topic for just a second, Eram, but this really hit me when I first visited China some years ago, because I went, and as an American, I hate to say it, but we're basically indoctrinated into the fact that China is a terrible country, that they have everything wrong, that they're really backward in so many different ways. When I was growing up, in fact, some of my Chinese friends actually said this is true, but what I was told is eat all your vegetables because there are children starving in China. This was our perspective, right? Really deep. And then I go to China and I see like technology is way beyond the Western, the US and European technologies in certain areas. There are touches that you just don't see in the West, orchids sitting on the airplane, on the the check-in counters and things, little things like that, and you go into the rural, in the cities, people are more protected, but you go into the rural areas and the hearts are so big, they just take you in. And this has also been my experience visiting Pakistan. I was fortunate enough to visit Iran in Pakistan once, and I just was welcomed with open arms, and it just felt like I felt like I was home. It was just like, oh, good, okay. So what I wanted to ask you about, and I hope it may be a little controversial, but I'm sure you can navigate this, is that on the one hand, Islam has such a beautiful tradition, and on the other hand, the lived life of many Muslims seems to contradict many of the things that I've learned about, at least from Iram, as being, fundamentals of Islam. The one I was referring to is something to the effect that what kind of the Prophet, peace be upon him, was asked at some point, what would a Muslim never do? Something along these lines, right? And would a Muslim
commit? Can a moment commit such and such crime? And then
can a Muslim
through a list,
murder or steal or blah? And so go ahead, Iram, you finish.
So it was. So I'm just going to paraphrase that. One of the companions of the Prophet asked him, could a Muslim commit, let's say adultery? And the Prophet said, yeah, it's possible. And so he's not condoning it. He's just talking about the fact that, yeah, it could happen. It's not considered a good deed, obviously, it's a sin, but yeah, it could happen. It's like, could he steal? Yes, that could happen. Could he murder someone? Like, yes. And then he said, could he lie? And he said, no. cannot lie. So a lot of times people say, and I don't know the authenticity of the reference chain, Sitara, but the content of this hadith was always very real for me, because as Chris and I have, he's been my mentor, and one thing he has been driving home is, authenticity in everything, authenticity. So obviously you can't lie if you're going to try to be an authentic person. And when I first started off with Chris is too kind to mention this on camera, but I am happy to mention it. I considered myself a fairly truthful person. I was raised in a house where truth and honesty were high values. And I considered myself a fairly truthful person, but excuse me, but working with Chris, I was awakened to this rude reality that I was not. I considered white lies to be okay, and because Chris was my mentor in teaching me self-love and self-development, I began to see how that was one of the biggest barriers I had to self-development, because obviously I would tell white lies because I'm embarrassed about something, or there's something I'm trying to hide. And until I accept that, I'm not going to be able to accept myself. And either I'm going to have to improve myself, or I'm going to have to, find some other way to be open and honest and be vulnerable. So anyway, it led to so much self-development, to a point where I realized that, oh my God, you just can't, you just cannot lie. If you have iman, if you have faith, lying becomes extremely uncomfortable. And one of the things that, we used to talk about, Chris and I, and especially when he visited Pakistan as well, and my experience with Pakistanis and his experience with Pakistanis, that lying comes so naturally to them in the Muslim world now, especially in the Indian subcontinent. And it is a travesty, I think, because this religion, especially, I would talk to Chris about this, that the what do you call lakab, the names, that the title that Prophet Muhammad was known by before he became a prophet was the honest and truthful one. So honesty and truth are one of the most fundamental values that Islam upholds and actually puts a lot of emphasis on for Muslims. And yet we just take it so lightly. People lie all the time. Authenticity, honesty, truthfulness, unfortunately, is gone for the most part. We can't hear you, Chris.
Helps if I unmute. So I bring this up primarily as just one example. I think we could probably come up with more, but I don't think it's necessary. That there are certain paradoxes in the way Islam is lived versus the way it was originally expressed or taught through the Quran and the Hadiths, And I wonder if you might comment both on, I'll just comment on that, and what do you see as the way the resolution of this kind of dichotomy?
This is my sense, Chris. It isn't something that I have studied a lot as a question in itself, if that makes sense. I haven't done kind of extensive research on this. This is my speculative theorization around, I think, what happened. Listening to various scholars who talk about this. I think the turning point really over the last 100 years is as Muslims hit rock bottom. It's how you diagnose the problem, isn't it? If there's an illness, how do you diagnose and how do you find a solution? I think that a lot of Muslim scholars at that time turned towards a political solution. So they thought that the answer to the malaise, I want to use the word malaise, economic malaise, chronic poverty continues to this day. A lot of other issues around kind of how our societies were set up, at a legal kind of societal level, the dissonance that happened when new forms of, when French and British law gets written into our penal codes in our countries. It's a very discombobulating experience. right? So you lose your sense of self. And what our scholars then did was they turned towards politics as a solution. So I think particularly one particular scholar in the subcontinent, Maulana Maududi, has been very influential because he said that Islam actually wanted a political, that the fruition of the Islamic vision is a political fruition. And so if we were politically strong, the rest of the things will just sort themselves out. And his thought also inspired a lot of Arab scholars as well, not just, see, his thought kind of his ideas were not just contained to the subcontinent, they were translated into Arabic, they proliferated. And so there was very much a turning towards politics. The other thing was this sense of nostalgia came up. Now, nostalgia is a good thing, but nostalgia can also be pretty damaging because you look back and you think, oh, we had the caliphate, and wasn't it wonderful? Whereas modernity had brought these new things onto the horizon, including democratic forms of government. And the nation state was born. Now, the nation state is actually, again, quite a discombobulating experience because if you look at how the nation states were carved out, you had these situations where the Punjab, for example, where I'm from, culturally is almost identical to the Punjab in India. But now it's got a line running through it. So we can't meet other Punjabis, can we, from India? So ethnicities and people's ethnic kind of those ethnic groupings, ethnic communities became divided. So there was a lot happening at the political front. But our scholars thought the answer is political. And the answer is to try to implement the Sharia because our way of living has been disturbed and we want to implement the Sharia and return to the Sharia. But the return to Sharia was seen as more of a political project. The other thing that happened as a result of that was a non-acceptance as well, I feel, of democratic forms of government, because democracy was seen as something alien and Western. Whereas reformist scholars will now point out that the one guideline that the Quran gives about how you organize yourself in matters of dispute is through consultation. And democracy is a form of consultation. It's not perfect. We know it needs reform. We know capitalism is now holding it hostage. Yes, you could critique it. You could critique democracy. But as a form of government, it's actually very close to the Quran and what the Quran gives as a prescription. So there was this antagonism, kind of trying to find a sense of self, and a lot of the conversations that turned towards identity. I think politics and identity became more important to uphold. And the thing that needs to happen at that ground level, grassroots level, is a new political consciousness, a new awareness, new forms of knowledge, engagement with modernity. If you look at early Muslim scholars, they were perfectly comfortable translating Greek philosophy into Arabic. This is how Greek philosophy reached Europe. That's how the Renaissance happened. They were not feeling defensive about it because their view was all knowledge is God's knowledge. All knowledge is from God. You can critique it and refine it, but it's from God. Whereas Muslims, I think, turn more and more towards a form of traditional knowledge, which in a way is irrelevant now to our times. Because when it was developed, 12 centuries ago or 10 centuries ago, it talked to a different society. So what has happened is that rather than going into those deep philosophical questions around what that knowledge means for us, Muslims have tended to, up until now, to turn towards a political solution or political identity, a political sense of self. And we have to remember that this is not ancient history. This is near history, and this is living history. The World War was only 75 years ago. It's not been a long time. It's not been a long time. So we've had maybe 4 generations since then. And they have grown up in a very politically charged atmosphere. I think that it would also be fair for me to say that the interference in Muslim countries, whilst we scramble to try to find a sense of self, we still continue to have a lot of political and economic interference from the Western world. And we also know that the way capitalism has developed and the way society has become more money orientated as well, we know that money, by the way, is completely agnostic. Money doesn't care. Money doesn't care if you're Muslim or you're Hindu or you're an atheist. Money cares about shareholder equity and shareholder wealth. So money has then had its own politics. And I think some of it Muslim countries have not been able to control. But we have seen how the Gulf countries, when they found oil wealth, they became important players on that stage when it came to money. So I think it's a complex set of historical forces. But I have to say that our scholars have not have not done us proud. I think they were very well-intentioned, but I think they turned our attention more towards politics and towards identity. If you read the Quran is about inner purification, the things that Eram was talking about just now. It's about faith, it's about integrity, it's about commitment, it's about truthfulness. In Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second chapter in the Quran, there's a verse that says that a Muslim has these two traits. They're always truthful and they always keep their promises. So there is a level of integrity that's demanded. And I think if Muslims had actually become more comfortable with taking a humanistic approach, I genuinely feel that. Not a secular approach. It doesn't have to be secular. You can actually have humanistic approaches which are grounded in a spiritual tradition. They are ecumenical. It could be joining hands with other spiritual traditions. And also, we didn't have to go around saying, but we know the best answers, but we, kind of almost our own forms of supremacy have come out as well. People don't like me very much because I'm very good at doing it internal criticism as well. But I think it's important. We have to be honest with ourselves and have the bravery and the courage to be honest. So I feel that because of those reasons, because of there are socioeconomic reasons, there's chronic poverty, there is lack of education. I think we haven't solved the economic puzzle. I do feel that that's going to be essential. If you can't feed people, you cannot expect high morals from them because they're playing the game of survival. There is a reason why the Quran consistently turns to the most vulnerable in society: the widow, the orphan, the traveler, those who are debt slaves, those who are strangers in your city. Look after them. So for me, the Quran actually puts the economic dignity of man front and center, but we haven't paid attention to that. So we then have this really perfect storm, isn't it? That you have socioeconomic challenges, you have political challenges, you don't have a knowledge tradition which is grappling very well with modernity and what modernity is throwing at you. And modernity is throwing a lot of challenges to the West as well. I mean, look at the mental health crisis we're now seeing in young people. And we're not able to grapple with that. So I think Muslims need to step away from the politics a little bit and just focus on creating that ethical and knowledge tradition, because I think that's where the Renaissance will come from. I'm sure other people will say other things. This is my speculative theory.
I would love to make a comment, if I may, Eram, and then you should comment. But first of all, I just want to say, Sitara, I love how articulate you are.
Yes, she's, mashallah, so articulate. It's a joy to listen to her.
It is. It's just wow, I could sit and listen to this, to you for ages, for hours, And I want to say in different words what I heard you saying, which is that as a result of colonialism, as a result of the socio-political economic challenges that Muslims globally endured in various countries in various ways, solutions were sought, but the solution went to look outward to find the solution. Politics is an outward solution. And this is what Eram and I have been talking about for more than 10 years. Solutions never come from the outside, in my experience. Solutions only come from the inside out. I want to bring one example, and I hope I can say it in such a way it's not a statement of criticism, but just an observation. See, the little that I know about some of the ritual, I wrote a whole book, co-authored a book on the power and value of ritual, both religious ritual and non-religious rituals. And rituals are have tremendous power in allowing us to reconnect with what has meaning in our lives, right? What gives our lives purpose. And so when you look at some of the traditions, like you mentioned, some certain sayings that Muslims, repeat when they, at various points in conversation or beginning a task or this or that, the prayer 5 times a day, a prayer, of taking the time to reconnect with God. These rituals are absolutely so beautiful, so powerful. Eram and I have talked about this. I have such deep appreciation for those, because what they do is when they are practiced from a heart that is open and is with intent to connect with the Almighty, with Allah, then what they do is that they bring one back from this outer world that can be very chaotic and confusing, and it's easy to get lost in it, brings it back to the truth of life. It brings your mind, your consciousness, your awareness back to what is real and away from what is unreal, right? And my observation, again, this is not a criticism, it's just an observation, is that unfortunately, I think many Muslims, not all by any means, there are many Muslims who do pray with the deepest devotion, the deepest connection. And there are others who just seem to go through the motions, and that somehow, if I just do all the motions, then I'll go to heaven and I'll live in paradise. And I don't believe that's true. And I'd love your comment, but I just don't believe it's true. I don't believe that if you just go through the motions, if you just say the right words, if you just do your prayers 5 times a day, but you have no connection to what you're doing, if you have no connection to Allah, to the truth, to the Quran, to the teachings of the Prophet, that the rituals become useless. And this is not just true in Islam, by the way. You know, I was raised in a Christian household. It's true in Christianity. It's true in Judaism. It's true in Confucianism. It's true in every religion. Ritual, just going through the motions, in my opinion, has little, maybe a tiny little bit of value, but very little. The value of ritual is for what it was created for in the first place, which is to remind us of what is true and what is untrue, what is real and what is unreal. And so when we perform the rituals with that connection, you know, allowing them to remind us of what is really true in life and in our own lives, then I believe personally that our perspective broadens, and we begin to see that things like telling untruths or being dishonest, those things fall away naturally, because your connection to the truth of life is so strong that to speak untruth feels it's almost impossible at that point. You know, does that make sense to you?
Yes. Is it all right if I just come in briefly? Because when Chris mentioned the word connection, I was actually writing the word connection. I think, Chris, ritual is for me about course correction. So five prayers 5 times a day. I'm sat at work. I have the power to, because I'm a manager, I have the power to make things difficult for people. Let's say I could speak harshly to a member of staff in my team because I've been annoyed with something, or they have been harsh with me, right? And the human in me is like, why is this happening? And then I think, you know what, I finish this meeting, I have to say my afternoon prayer. So I'm going to be stood in front of God, and I'd be thinking, but I spoke very unkindly to somebody. So what ritual does is course correction. So 5 times a day, just when you're about to slip a little bit, go off the track, and then you think, oh, my next prayer is due. I'm going to be stood in front of God, and I'm not very proud of myself. So I think ritual does the course correction. But what is the course correction about? It's about the human being that I was talking to. And I will at some point, I don't know when I will find the time, I do actually want to write either a journal article, an academic piece, or a book about connectedness as a value in Islam. You know, when you read Islamic scholars and they talk about the fundamental values of Islam, they talk about justice and they talk about compassion. Those two always emerge as the highest values from the Quran. But actually, the more I read the Quran, the more I try to understand it, I think connectedness is also one of the highest values. And you've just mentioned connection. So I think
when you're mentioning connection, Sitara, it's not just connection to God, but connectedness.
No, it's connectedness with creation.
But see, the connection to all is connection to God. I just want to make this point. You know, that if we really know that God, that Allah is the creator of all things and is present in all things, then connection to anyone or anything is connection to God, connection to Allah.
That's right. Yeah. You know? Connection to people is connection to God. And I think in the saying that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has, and this is an authentic tradition from him, he says that the angel Gabriel, Jibreel alayhi salam, who used to bring revelation to him, that he used to insist on the rights of neighbors so much that I thought he will bring a revelation to me and say, you must share your inheritance and your estate with your neighbor when you die. So I think that that's him encapsulating the idea of connection. There are other reports that say that you will be questioned if your neighbor goes to sleep hungry. Why did you not know that the person next door to you is starving? So I think connectedness with the Creator is
And by the way, I just want to remind people that the times that we're talking about, Muslims would live right next to non-Muslims.
Yes.
So, so it didn't
This
matter
isn't
whether
religion
your neighbor,
specific.
yeah,
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
not
yeah.
religion specific. If your neighbor went to sleep hungry, you're going to be questioned about it.
That's right. So when the Quran is talking about the widows and orphans, it's not putting in brackets Muslim widows, Muslim orphans.
Mm.
It's not bracketing it. It is simply saying those who are vulnerable in society. And I read somebody somewhere, I was reading an article in The Guardian the other day, and somebody was saying that the measure of a society is how it treats the vulnerable in that society.
Yes.
And I
That's
think these are some of the lessons that Muslims have forgotten. In our nostalgia, in our turn to the past, because we look to the past rather than looking towards the future and trying to create a better future for all humanity, we're actually looking towards the past. We're looking for the golden age of Islam, the nostalgia. If we were to recreate those forms of government, if we recreated those forms of society, if we recreated those forms of dress, then we will somehow find the realization of the vision of Islam. And I think that is where our diagnosis of the problem and the solution we found, I think, is mismatched to what is required at the moment. So absolutely, that connectedness with people is going to demand then things like truthfulness, things like your authenticity, things like vulnerability, ability to apologize, keeping your promises, being punctual, being on time, paying your taxes. I say to my sons that in this day and age, paying your taxes is actually a religious obligation. Why? Because you have signed a citizenship contract with the government, and your taxes are the main welfare system for the vulnerable in society. It is a religious obligation to pay your taxes. It's not a secular obligation. So because we haven't created those discourses, and the beauty of Islam, as Talal Asad tells us, he's an anthropologist. He's written an incredible paper about what Islam is. How do you define it? By the way, it's almost impossible to define Islam, but I think his definition is a good one. He says Islam is a discursive tradition.
Hmm.
Islam is the conversation. The conversation needs to be different, I think.
That is beautiful. Really, really beautiful. Thank you. Before we run out of time, I want to just cover two more topics, Chris. One, I think because when people, I know many of our Western friends, they're going to be listening to you and they're going to be saying, wow, that's a strong-minded woman with a very methodical mind, very sure of her opinions. And, the definition of a strong, independent woman. Okay, well then how does she explain the treatment of Muslim women in the Muslim countries right now, such as Afghanistan?
Yeah. I will start by saying, Eram and Chris, that I think patriarchy is not specifically an Islamic problem. I think there's a particular version of it that we're grappling with. Patriarchy predates Islam. Scholars who research patriarchy will put it to about 4,000 years in the past. So patriarchy has existed as a hegemonic oppressive system for 4,000 years. In the Western tradition, there is huge amounts of patriarchy and misogyny about women. And some of it has been written into some of what we now see, what the scholars were then seeing as their sciences, scientific knowledge. So you could say things like the church could burn women at the stake because they were witches. They had knowledge, they were asking questions, or they were brewing medicine, so you could burn them at the stake. Women did not have the right to inherit, women did not have the right to vote. Those strands of kind of patriarchy and misogyny have existed throughout history. And I actually think that women have a shared experience of oppression here, that women should come together regardless of religion and deal with that oppression. But women do get divided, and patriarchy is very, very good at dividing women and not letting them collaborate. There's some interesting theories on that. So I don't think that patriarchy is a particularly Islamic problem. I think what has happened is that when we have taken that, when Muslim countries have taken that political turn, and some of that political discourse has been funded by oil money and petrodollars, as we call them, it has led to a particular form of Islam emerging in the last 30 years. And that form of Islam plays out its politics on women's bodies, women's clothes, women's access to the public space, women's voices. Why? Because it is education, it is very easy to point to a shrouded woman and say, look, this is how we're different from you. because it is such a visible marker. That visible marker can be co-opted into a highly political project. So women have been a victim of that. The other thing that's happened is because we haven't created new knowledge, we have turned again and again to the knowledge that was created 800 or 900 years ago in a set of circumstances when women were subordinate to men, when women had to rely on men for protection. You know, you couldn't go out and travel alone. You would be killed or raped or assaulted. So women had no choice but to be under the subordination of men. And some of our knowledge tradition, and again, Islam is not unique in this. You will see similar things in Christianity. You'll see similar things in Judaism and other knowledge traditions. Women were seen as a step below men. So I think what has happened, particularly in Muslim countries, is as we've tried to find our sense of self, we have thought, okay, we need to dress like this and we need to look like this. And Islam has particular constraints about women. And so some of the opinions of scholars, where there are those correctives are available, those have been hidden from these popular narratives. I'll give you an example. So there is a book, I forget the scholar's name, I'm really sorry, but my PhD supervisor's wife, mashallah, she's got a doctorate as well, and she's written on this. She's published 2 books now with Oxford University Press, where she is recentering the Hadith tradition. And she tells us that the Prophet's wife, Aisha, who, as we know, as one of the great legal minds in Islam, she actually gave correctives about some misogynistic hadiths. So, by the way, hadith, as I said, also as a result of a political project, canonization happened. So some hadith traditions are misogynistic towards women. They don't go back to the Prophet. They can be critiqued, but they are misogynistic. And Aisha had given correctives of 200 hadith reports, 200 200 traditions. And there was a scholar who had written about this about 4 centuries after the Prophet passed away. This scholar had documented Aisha's correctives.
Wow.
But nobody knows about his book. So my supervisor's wife, Dr. Sophia Rahman, she has done her PhD and she has translated a chapter of that book. And by translating it, she is recentering women. She is putting women at the heart of this endeavor. So I think one of the tragedies that's happened is that women have been written out of our own knowledge tradition. And it's our responsibility as Muslim scholars, particularly those in the West, because we have the freedoms, Eram, that women in the East don't, that we need to recenter. But as I say that, I'm conscious that Islam is not alone in this. I don't know if it was Maya Angelou. Was it Maya Angelou? I can't remember. I think she said that whenever history has been written, it's been written by men. And so men stand at the center of history and women stand at the periphery. And she's going to bring men to the periphery. So
it sounds like Maya.
I think it was her. I could be wrong, but I
like
find it so
Maya.
inspiring, right? So what I think the similar movements are happening in the West, where we have seen now that there were female scientists who made amazing scientific discoveries, but they were written out of research papers. They were written out of scientific papers. And similarly here, so I think Muslim women have to find precedents. They have to find those role models who have been written out of history. What has happened in Afghanistan is, and this is where it is so ironic, Afghani women are one of the most independent-minded, bold women culturally that you can come across. I was at a conference where this expert in the Afghan institution was saying that the last refresh of the Afghan institution was done in consultation with Afghan women. They wrote the constitution of the country.
Wow.
You then have this group of the people, the Taliban, who are very violent, militant groups, who are already violent and militant and patriarchal and misogynistic. And what they do is then they co-opt religion to justify the violence that they're perpetrating against women. And that is what has happened in Afghanistan. And that's why Afghani women are now still raising their voice. Just yesterday, there was a piece about how they want the United Nations to recognize gender apartheid as a crime.
Wow.
Because at the moment they're being silenced. So Afghan women, if you actually look into Afghan culture, are very strong women. Afghan women have been university professors, court judges. They have been really high level officials in the Afghan government. So what is happening now is actually a blip in Afghan history. This isn't the norm. This is not how Afghan women were never these subordinate creatures. They were always very bold women and very active in the public space. So
You know, Sitara, I
yeah,
think the point that you made, I'm sorry.
no, go on.
If the point that you made, I think, is extremely well taken, that this whole concept of the patriarchy, not just the concept, but the actual reality of the patriarchy is not limited to the Islamic world by any shape, any means. You know, I just wanted to share a friend that I think Eram knows, and I think you've interviewed her, Eram, a transformational leader by the name of Lynn Twist, who wrote a book called The Soul of Money. She wrote she's very connected to the South American traditions, and she described this the way, the prophecy, I guess you would say, of the Native Americans, the indigenous peoples of South America, described that humanity was like a bird, but it's been flying for thousands of years with a broken wing. That one wing was the masculine, the other wing was the feminine, but it's been one wing has been broken and not able to function properly, and as a result, the bird has been going around and around in circles, and not actually moving forward. And that the prophecy from South America, at least, is that now it's time for the feminine to heal, the feminine to heal, and in that healing, then not to become dominant, but rather to once again take their rightful place with the masculine, so that the human race can move forward. In fact, from my perspective, so the human race can survive, because where we are today, some of the elements of the masculine patriarchal society is a focus on logic, reason, independence, doing things on your own, which all have its value. Pardon?
Power.
Competition and power.
Power, accumulation of power.
Accumulation of power.
But there are many positive qualities to the masculine.
Yes.
Yeah.
But when you only have the masculine without the balance of the feminine, what you end up with is technological progress that has side effects that could destroy the world. Okay. Mm-hmm. You end up with great advances in certain areas, but they destroy the climate, and so we can no longer survive on the planet. There's this is like one wing flapping, where you get some progress, what appears to be progress, but on the other side there are side effects because there's a lack of balance from the feminine. My perspective.
No, I
you
think
end up with this kind of skewed progress that actually threatens humanity as much as it provides opportunities for humanity. I mean, we're very fortunate in the West, particularly, that we have more free time, and I certainly can say this, we have more free time than ever in history. But the other side of that is that we have more destructive capabilities in many different areas of our societies than we ever have had in history as well. And so I think you're absolutely right that go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish.
I just want to finish my sentence. Just say that there are this patriarchal or masculine. I'll just say the masculine dominance in the world is absolutely not an Islamic.
No.
It is a global issue that affects every society, every religion, every culture at the deepest, most profound level. Eram, please.
Yes, thank you, Chris. I totally agree with whatever you both said, and absolutely the world needs more women. The Western women have been rising up already, and we're beginning to see the positive changes that have come out of that. I was just listening to this podcast yesterday, Chris, and this lady has written a really well-researched, amazing book. But the scary thing is, she's researched, everything around nuclear warheads and stuff like that. And now there are 10 countries, and it was shocking to hear how we all think that there must be so many checks and balances about preventing nuclear war. And actually, when you learn the truth, and she just researched America, it is terrifying how even things can go wrong sometimes. And 70 minutes, it will take 70 minutes to literally destroy 70% of the population. and the rest will be left diseased and dying. So whatever we have done for thousands of years is literally a click of a button away, and that button is not really that well guarded as we are led to believe. So I'll try to put the name of her book in the description of the video when we publish this. But what was interesting to me was that, again, women have been kept out of this. It's like the different heads of these nuclear states are all men. And if we know one thing, it's not about blaming anybody, like what you were saying. There are some beautiful aspects and attributes of the masculine, and similarly beautiful and very useful attributes, necessary attributes of the feminine, and together they bring balance. It should at the very least be made mandatory that each of those heads of states, part of their protocol should be that they've got to consult a woman. Because no matter what, first of all, two minds are better than one. And then we know that women are naturally, their motherhood, she's just not going to be able to come to terms with destroying millions of children. Not that the man would, but it's for a woman, it's going to be far more difficult because she's going to see her kids in all those other kids anyway. And that's not to say for every woman, but I'm just talking about in general. And then the other thing I wanted to say, I wanted to make a comment because I always say Muslim women will change the world. And one of the things that I use as proof for what I'm saying is that we know, if we study history, and I'm talking about human history because Islamic history is part of human history, we know that the world did change for the better 1400 years ago. The world used to be very violent. People were always fighting. There was no notion of ethics. Islam was really, truly the first religion, or even a body of work, or a framework that put human rights and ethics at the core center of everything, right? So I'm not going to say it was the first to bring that idea. I'm saying it was the first to not only bring the idea, but provide the whole framework in minute detail, and then also implement it to show how that looks like and how that works. And that helped not only women to have rights and grow and then use their services to bring this amazing change in the world. For 1,000 years, humanity fared better because of the contributions of the Muslims. So we have an example, is what I'm saying. We have an example how the world can change for the better. And because Muslim women have been oppressed for so long, they are very incentivized to do something about it, to take their rights back. But when they do it, it's going to be because Islam says it's, justice and equality and fairness for all. When they embrace that to raise their status, they're automatically going to have to apply it for the rest of the world, for everybody else, which is what Islam did 1400 years ago. So, and I'm going to shut up after this and let you wise people talk. And I've shared this with you, Chris, many times. Dalai Lama said, the Western woman is going to change the world. And I totally agree with it. And I say, with all due respect, she's going to first help her sister in the East and help her to rise up. And together, women are going to change the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they are. And you're right. I think that oppression, that shared oppression, is a very powerful impetus to bring that change.
And all women share that. We all share that pain.
Yeah.
Sitara, as we come to a close, maybe it would be appropriate, since this is your area of expertise, to ask you a question about financial issues. Would that be all right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I wonder if you might share how Islamic teachings can contribute or even solve the global economic challenges that we face today. And if you would also I'm going to combine two questions together. I'd love for you to also address how Islam traditionally, if I understand correctly from Eram at least, Islam traditionally has protected the finances of women and given them the ability to be independent if necessary from their husbands, and that and just comment on what that, if that was fully realized, what could that mean both for Muslim women and for the world? So there's a big, broad question. You can take wherever you want.
I think as far as rights are concerned, Chris, we know that the Quran goes into a lot of detail about the inheritance rights that women have. It also sets women's rights in marriage, the right to maintenance. If a woman is pregnant and a divorce is happening, then how would the husband support her during that period of time? How would the child be supported? There's a lot of detail in there. So Islam was revolutionary in the sense that it's giving all of these rules and regulations at a time when women are inherited as property. Women had no right of inheritance. They were completely dependent on men. So the first thing it's doing is it's in our times we would call it asset or wealth concentration. So Islam is actually doing away with that wealth concentration in the hands of men. Interesting though, I think Oxfam maybe published this data recently that 70% of the world's wealth and assets are still controlled by men. 30%, roughly 30% by women. So we still have a long journey to make. But Islam had started that trajectory of breaking that wealth concentration. The inheritance rights and the rules of inheritance do that as well. Now, whether societies implement those and how faithfully they implement those is a separate question. But we do know that we have plenty of examples in the Islamic tradition, in Muslim societies, where women were given their inheritance, and many women actually chose to use that inheritance for what we call trust, an endowment, a waqf, where you would give your wealth to an institution, for example. Like alumni would now do it for a university, philanthropic endowments and things like that. So that's, and I think this is why women's financial independence is so important, because a woman's financial independence is the first doorway into her realizing her potential and her rights. Because the thing is, it really is as simple as that. If I'm dependent on my husband to feed me, I'm not going to be able to do much with my life, because if he gets angry with me, he might just cut off my stipend or say that I'm just not going to, you'll be homeless. If you don't comply, you'll be homeless. So I think it does create a relationship of compliance. And one of the things that the Quran is doing is making women very independent, so they don't have that relationship of compliance. It truly are two equal people in a marriage. It's a partnership of equals. And I think this is also why the Quran says that men and women are supporters and guardians of each other, because it sees them as equals. It doesn't see one person dependent on the other. Indignity or enslavement of any kind is not something you could fit into the Quranic moral framework. It just chucks it out. So there is the theological and religious justification for that. But then there is also the fact that if, as I was saying earlier, if people are facing abject poverty or indignity every day, they're not going to be able to do anything else in life apart from worry about how they'll feed their children and how they feed themselves, right? When you're in an empty stomach, life completely takes a different form for you. One of the disservices that our scholars have done is around glorification of poverty, because there's this idea that poverty can be a test from God, and that's fine. Poverty can be a test from God, but we shouldn't glorify the perpetual existence of poverty or normalize it. Poverty is abnormal in human society, and we should always work to eradicate poverty. Poverty is not a natural phenomenon. It happens as a result of economic and political choices that governments and other influential actors make. So what Islam does is it gives you a few guidelines in terms of economics. One, it has a highly redistributive taxation system. We know that Western governments are still shying away from talking about wealth taxes. And I'm sat here thinking, how long will you tax income and work? People are no longer able to pay their taxes and heat their homes. You have to tax wealth. Islam gave a redistributive wealth taxation system 1,500 years ago. It is incredibly powerful. By the way, it's set at 2.5%. I think if Jeff Bezos parts with 2.5% of his wealth, it's not going to make even a dent in his lifestyle, but it might feed two countries, right? So 2.5% seems small. It's actually very big when you look at this level of wealth concentration. The other thing Islam does is that it absolutely forbids exploitative forms of lending, because that enslaves people. So that is my area of research, is around that, what those exploitative forms of lending are. And I've actually disagreed with our orthodoxy. As you would expect by now, I have disagreed with the orthodoxy on that. And I think the really important thing, Chris, is that Islam grounds all of that in a sense of spirituality and care, and that word I used, connectedness with your environment. In other words, rampant consumerism, extravagant expenditure, just parking your yacht, your super yacht in Monaco and paying $10,000 every day just to park your yacht. That kind of thing would be considered in Islam, would be considered to be an extravagance for which you're answerable to God. So by bringing spirituality into it, Islam also wants to, that inner work that we talked about, the inner work we need to do, it actually wants to curtail our hunger for stuff. The very materialistic, consumeristic ethos that's now taken, we're hostage to it, and that's why the planet is dying, because we're consuming so fast that the planet can't replenish, nature can't replenish itself. So by making us connected with nature as well, and there are a lot of verses in the Quran that connect us to nature, even to the extent that the Quran says that bees and ants are communities like you. The communities. So we're supposed to think of animals and biodiversity as communities, what we now call habitats, and ecosystem, and the food web and all the chains. So everything's linked together. So the spiritual, I think, is really important in curtailing some of the base desires that human beings have to just consume constantly. And we know now that consumption has reached such a level that we're also trying to do away with our unhappiness by consuming more. We think that if we buy more stuff, we'll be happier people. So I think to have any conversation in Islamic economics without spirituality, without that orientation towards God, is just not possible. You have to do that. And that's why a lot of Islamic scholars, when they talk about the Islamic economy, they start from the concept of monotheism and tawheed, that connection with God. And what does that imply for the economic choices you make, which should be spiritual, moral, ethical. So we shouldn't be engaging in economic exploitation. You would be answerable to God for that. So I personally believe that actually by Islamic economics, if developed properly, would really challenge the assumptions of the classical economic theory that emerged in the West, because classical economic theory just thinks about allocation of resources. It's a very dry, very sanitized way of looking at how human beings deal with each other, whereas spiritual traditions will talk about human behavior, human wants and needs, human desires, and the current economic syllabus, by the way, that we read, what I read in Pakistan, is the syllabus that comes from America. So I think some of the philosophical assumptions for economic theory need to be changed and questioned, which is why philosophy and economy sit so well together as subjects. You're studying them at history.
Yeah.
So I think that this is where Islam can make a huge contribution, is to challenge some of the philosophical assumptions sitting under the neoliberal economic model. I don't think that's our Islamic theories have matured enough, but there's huge room there to create that more mature theory and foundation.
That's actually quite exciting, I would say.
Yeah,
Very
it is.
exciting.
Yeah, it really is.
Tremendous
It's a solution.
opportunity.
Yeah.
And as we close, I just have to make a comment. I'm sure Eram, you would like to make a comment, but for me, the result of discussions like this always comes back to one fundamental, and that is that our connection to the infinite is the basis and solution to all things. It's just we've talked about the issues that exist within, the practice of Islam. We've talked about the patriarchy, the issues that arise from that globally. We've talked about the economic issues. All of these things ultimately, from my perspective, come from our looking outward at trying to solve problems in the material world without reference to the spiritual, without reference to that infinite aspect of life, which really governs everything in existence. I mean, it's so interesting to me that human beings somehow, whatever our religion may be, we sometimes forget that we're just on a planet that kind of goes around this star, again and again. And we just take it for granted. Okay, oh, it happens every day, and it turns, every 24 hours, and every year we go around and we don't even think about it. But how is that possible? How is that miracle possible? How is it that we can see stars in the sky, and that there are plants that grow without anything from human beings? Nothing's happening from human beings, and yet we're surrounded by miracles constantly, and we forget that if we want miracles in our own life, we have to come back to that same source, which is governing and guiding and creating the miracles that exist in this world. And we keep thinking that we as human beings know better than God, and that, I think, is our fundamental challenge, to be honest. So Sitara, I just want to thank you from my side for just a really eloquent, beautiful exposition of these issues and the various aspects, looking at them from different perspectives. From you just, as we said earlier, you have such a beautiful way of expressing yourself and such clarity in your expressions that I find it just a real treat and honor and a privilege to sit with you. So thank you so much for giving us this opportunity.
Yeah. I would also like to thank you, Sitara, because ditto everything that Chris said, because he's also got a great expression. So ditto all of that. And also, I am just so proud of you. I just love sharing this space with you every time, Sitara. And, to be able to showcase or promote your work on any of my platforms is always an honor. As I said to you earlier, that the work you have done, the research you have done, you have not done just for yourself. You have done it for me. You have done it for my daughters. You have done it for so many other Muslim women and humans, basically, because we are all connected. So, to be able to, it is such a joy to be able to love, support, and be the champion of other Muslim women that, are at the moment at the forefront. You're trailblazers, and you're lighting the way, you're making the path so that it becomes easier for other Muslim women to follow. And I know that our Western friends watching and listening, women especially, know what that feels like, because they've been through that journey. They're a few decades ahead of us, but this is an effort for all women, especially. So joining hands and supporting each other. I know that this particular quote is by Maya Angelou, that she said there's a special place in hell for women don't support other women. I believe that, because it is essential for humanity, as we just discussed.
Yes.
And the second thing I also want to say is to appreciate you as well, Chris. Always, you have been such a beautiful friend and a guide and a mentor. And this is what this world is moving towards, and what a beautiful place it is going to be, where we not only can accept our differences, but really appreciate them. When we were talking about the 5 prayers and the rituals and all of that, and I was reminded on different occasions, Chris, when we've traveled, sometimes we were in Italy, sometimes in Germany, sometimes in another country. And Sitara, Chris has had like a 45 or 50-year-old practice of daily meditation. He does meditation twice. And so it would be sometimes that Chris has to do his meditation, and it's either Zohar or Asr prayer time for me. And so Chris is doing his thing and I'm doing my thing, right? And yet we are basically doing the same thing, which is, disconnecting from the world, connecting to the divine in our own way. Or sometimes Chris, when, Chris always has this practice of being very intentional. He's very intentional about everything. And, would be getting food, lunch or dinner or something. And he would just make sure that he took out a few moments to offer his gratitude to God and bless his food. So I'll do that sometimes with him. But then he would be like, well, say that thing that you always say, which is Bismillah Rahman Rahim. And I would say that. So again, just loving and appreciating the differences, accepting them for what they are, appreciating the beauty of them, staying true to our own, traditions, you know, I'm a Muslim, Chris is not, but it's just so beautiful to be able to see the core and essence and the beauty of those universal truths. And yes, it expresses differently in different people's lives. And I think I'm excited because I think that's where we're moving towards, Sitara. I think that's where the world is slowly moving towards, is this love, this connectedness, and this inclusion.
It is, yeah. And the diversity is
Yeah, the
strength.
diversity, yes.
Diversity is strength. One of the things I always say to sometimes when Muslims do delve into some more, or other people, more divisive discussions, is just break bread together, sit with somebody, have a cup
Yeah.
of tea with them, and you'll find that you have a lot more in common with them because we have this shared humanity. The differences are very small. And if both people are able to respect each other, actually, you can talk about those differences in really healthy ways. So you learn from each other. So I think that breaking bread is such a great way of dealing with some of our differences. Just sit at the table, share a meal. I think the only other thing I want to add, and thank you for having me and giving me all of this space, but I feel that women, I think up until now, humanity has been on a journey, and the reason why it's been destructive is because it's been a journey of trying to exploit resources around us and exploit other people, and then just a few people becoming rich. I think a service ethos, a public service ethos, is a better ethos. And I think
Yeah.
when if Muslims too were to reconfigure their thinking and say, I'm here to serve humanity, I'm here to make this world a better place, I think that this is a vision that many, many people will gather around, Muslim or non-Muslim. So I feel that serving humanity is probably the best message that we can get out, and a shared goal to bring people together, regardless of faith, regardless of their ethnicity or race or whatever, doesn't matter. That is one goal that I think that most people can agree on, because diversity is
Yeah.
beautiful and diversity is strength. You need to
Yes,
have diverse voices to do your best work. Yeah.
That's
I'm
right.
into that.
And I have to say, Irma has shared with me this idea of becoming a slave of Allah, right? And that's all that means, is to be an instrument for Allah, for God, to be of service in the world. And that to me is really the truth of life. Ultimately, that's what we are all called to do. This is the reason we were born, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've lost, when we
Incredibly
think we're
fulfilling.
separate, we
Yeah.
think we're separate. We think,
Yeah.
oh, that person could take something from me, or I could take something from them. Then we lose the whole thing. But when we realize the connection, when we realize that we're interdependent, then we realize that one is not more or less, better or worse, that we're all unique, we're all special, we all have our own gifts, and together we have the ability to accomplish more than any of us individually, then life changes dramatically. And this is what I have taken away from my time with you, and with talking with Iram, learning more about Islam and the Quran and teachings of Islam. Really, this is it for me, is what you expressed it like that we all have the opportunity and are called to be instruments of the will of the divine, the will of the infinite. And when we really step into that purpose, then our world will shift, it will change.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well,
Thank you very much
both
for
of
having
you.
me.
Thank you. Lots of love.
Great.
And thank you to our viewers as well. Please make sure you comment, let us know what you think. And of course, we'll probably have to bring Sitara back again for another conversation. Lots of love.